Okay, there we go. All right, and I'm just going to ask everybody to mute themselves. And then I'm going to take questions at the end. Okay. So hello again. Thanks for bearing with me there. So like I said, it's really nice to be able to do a presentation about something that I'm really passionate about, which is horseshoe crabs. And as a kid growing up on Long Island, I always thought horseshoe crabs were really interesting, but I think I kind of took them for granted, like a lot of people who are from the East Coast of the US. But I think it wasn't until I moved to California for 7 years in my 20s that I kind of started to miss them. And, you know, because they don't have horseshoe crabs on the West Coast. So wasn't until, you know, I moved back here that I started to really learn everything that I could about them. And the more that I found out about how fascinating they are, the more that I just totally fell in love with them. So I hope you will fall in love with them too, after you learn a little more about them. So without further ado, here we go. So horseshoe crabs, they've outlived everything, but can they outlive us? And I borrowed this picture from my favorite satirical newspaper, The Onion. Was one of my favorite articles.
Figure out why this is doing this.
Person from out of town who who had never seen a horseshoe crab before and was clearly freaked out by it.
Okay, you can go in your room. Right? We're going to echo on each other.
So in this presentation, I am going to cover what horseshoe crabs are, where they're found, and why we should care about them. What are some current and historical threats to horseshoe crabs, an overview of conservation efforts in the US and Asia, and what more can be done. So horseshoe crabs have been in existence relatively unchanged for approximately 445 million years. And to put that in perspective, that's 200 million years before dinosaurs even existed. And they have survived 5 mass extinctions. So they are arthropods, which means that they're not true crabs. They are more closely related to spiders and arachnids. Oh. Come on, there we go. So there are 4 extant or surviving species of horseshoe crabs. There is 1 American species and 3 Asian species. The American species is Limulus polyphemus, which is known as the American or the Atlantic horseshoe crab. Tachypleus tridentatus, or the tri-spine horseshoe crab. Oops, let me go back there. Tachypleus gijas, which is the Indo-Pacific horseshoe crab, and the Carcinoscorpius rotundicata, which is the mangrove horseshoe crab. And this is just a map of where they are all found around the world. You can see that the Atlantic horseshoe crab is found all the way up and down the east coast of the United States, and even in some areas down in Mexico and the Yucatan Peninsula. The tri-spine horseshoe crab is found from Japan down the east coast of Asia. The Indo-Pacific, is found in India and Indonesia and parts of the Pacific. And the mangrove and the Tachypleus gijas are found also in parts of South Pacific. So horseshoe crabs spend most of their lives near estuaries, but they can venture as far out as the continental shelf for food. And they are considered, generalists, which means that they are able to survive in a wide range of temperatures and salinities. They do come back to the shore to spawn, and they do so down the east coast of the United States during the full and new moon high tides from May through August, depending on latitude. So the biggest spawning ground is actually down in Delaware Bay. And The females are much larger than the males. And really the only other morphological difference is that the males have this like boxing glove-like appendage up front, which they use to grab onto the females during spawning periods. So the females kind of like drag the females lay the eggs, and they lay a lot of eggs. They lay between 3,000 and 4,000 eggs per clutch, and up to 88,000 eggs in one season. So they're considered, a highly fertile species. So like I said, the males kind of, grab onto the females with those claws, and the females will drag them over the eggs. So horseshoe crabs are not actually sexually mature until they're about 10 years of age. So they're considered a late maturing species, but they can live to be about 20 years old. So those large horseshoe crabs that you find on the beach, they're actually about a decade or so old, which is pretty cool. So they go through several embryonic stages of development before they hatch, which happens at about 28 days. And you can see in these cool pictures here of the little embryonic stages. And then when they hatch into this trilobite larval stage, or what is known as the first instar stage, and then they move offshore, and they can molt up to 18 times before they reach maturity. And just one interesting little tidbit of information. If you go to the beach toward the end of the summer, early fall, and you happen to see a bunch of what appears to be dead horseshoe crabs on the shore, they might not actually be dead crabs. It might just be their shells, which are molted off. And the way you can tell is if you turn it over gently, you'll see this little slit up at the top of the shell, and that's actually where they molt. They just kind of like completely slide out of the top of the shell, which I think is super cool. So you can do your own little investigation there. So why should we care about horseshoe crabs, I guess is the big question. And so this chart is from the IUCN Red List. So the IUCN is basically, it's the International Union of the Conservation of Nature. And what they are is the global authority on the conservation status of various species around the world. So as you can see in 2016, actually earlier than that, they listed the Atlantic horseshoe crab as vulnerable, which is just under endangered. The tri-spine horseshoe crab, or the Tachypleus tridentatus, was listed as endangered only as recently as 2018. And then the two other species found in Asia are considered data deficient, which is self-explanatory. They don't really have enough data to quantify their population size. So horseshoe crabs are a keystone species, which means that it has a disproportionate effect on the environment relative to its abundance. This is particularly true for the migrating species of shorebird, specifically the roofer red knot. So every year, the red knots make this really long journey from 16,000 miles from the tip of South America to the Arctic. And they stop over in the Delaware Bay, like I said, was one of the really big horseshoe crab spawning grounds. And they feast on the horseshoe crab eggs. So horseshoe crab eggs are really fit, rich in fatty acids, and they provide sustenance for the red knots on this important stopover before they continue on their migration. So between 1998 and about 2008, I think, there was a 78% decline in the red knot population, and red knots were put on the endangered species list in that time. And actually what they determined was that the decline was related to a decline in female horseshoe crabs, mainly because of overharvesting them for use as bait. And I'll talk a little more about that when I get to the threats of horseshoe crabs. Another reason why they're really interesting is because of their blood. They have this amazing blue colored, it's copper-based blue blood, which has been used in the biomedical industry for over 30 years, basically because there is an element in horseshoe crab blood, which is called limulus amoebocyte lysate, or LAL. For the Tachypleus, it's called Tachypleus amoebocyte lysate, or TA.
Vai lá, vem aqui ligeiro.
Hello. Okay, move on. So when the substance comes into contact with bacteria, it immediately forms a visible clot. So like I said, for over 30 years, it's been considered the gold standard in biomedical facilities around the world to screen for bacteria in pretty much every single pharmaceutical substance, surgical device, medical implant that comes into contact with the internal human body. So horseshoe crab blood is really valuable. It is estimated to cost about $1,500 a quart and about $60,000 a gallon. Yeah, the first time I saw one of these photos of the horseshoe crabs strapped to the rack, it was like something out of a sci-fi movie. I couldn't believe that they did this. But it is important to note that horseshoe crab blood was a key element in testing the purity of COVID vaccines and still is. So what are the biggest threats to horseshoe crabs? And I wrote, I'll give you a hint. It's us. Big surprise. So between 1850 and 1920, horseshoe crabs were just harvested by the millions every year and ground up and used as fertilizer. The biggest current threat is that they are harvested to use as bait in the US eel and whelk or conch fisheries. And unfortunately, when the lobster fishery collapsed on Long Island, more Long Island fishermen were forced to turn to fishing eel and whelk to make a living. So these fisheries also really began to take off in the 1980s, and that was due to an international demand for eel and conch. So in parts of Asia, horseshoe crabs are eaten as food, especially considered a delicacy, the ones that have eggs, the egg-laden females. And the horseshoe crabs were sold in the US in ethnic food markets from about the 1800s.
Agora tu pode seguir olhando lá, só não fecha tanto.
Tu vê, eles comem. Olha
Hello.
aqui, ó, o que eles fazem para tirar o sangue.
Can I just ask you guys to put yourselves on mute, or let me see if I can find the controls here.
Christine, I'm trying to mute them, Christine.
Let's see.
There you go, Christine, I'll mute them.
Give me 1 second. There we go.
Christine, I'm muting people.
Thank you. Are you able to?
Yep, I've been doing that.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure who that was, but. Okay, so, oops, how'd I get so far ahead? There we go. Okay, so of course, the other threat to them is that they are bled for biomedical use. And in the US, they don't actually bleed them to death, which sounds horrible. They take about 30% of their blood and then they return them to the water. This is different from in China, where they are bled to death. They take 100% of their blood. And then the carcasses are either used for food or ground up and used for certain things in Chinese medicine. So it's important to note that although we don't technically bleed them to death in the United States, the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission estimates that there is a 15% mortality rate. And then this is due just to the ordeal of going through the bleeding process. So when you take into account that the crabs are plucked from the sea, they're held on a dock somewhere, they're driven to a lab, put in a holding pen, strapped to the rack like you see in the photo, bled, and then, you know, go through the whole process again, get back on the truck. Of course, there's going to be casualties involved in that. So once they are released back into the water, a lot of them are depleted and disoriented. So it can have an effect on their feeding and spawning patterns for sure. So luckily, there is some hope that has arrived in the form of a synthetic version of the LAL test called the recombinant factor C test, or RFC for short. Here is one on the screen made by Alonda. Oops, keep touching things. This test was actually patented about 18 years ago in Singapore, but there's been a slow rollout process because I mentioned for over 30 years, the LAL and TAL tests have been considered by the FDA to be the gold standard test. So in 2018, the first RFC tested drug, I should say, was approved by the FDA, but in order for the test to take the place of LAL, they have to be approved by these organizations called pharmacopoeias. These are basically scientific organizations that set the standards for pharmaceutical manufacturing. So there is a US pharmacopoeia, European, Chinese, Japanese, etc. So yeah, I should just mention that in 2018 and 2019, the European, Chinese, and Japanese pharmacopoeias published guidelines on the use of the RFC test, paving the way for its use. And the United States was supposed to do this along with them, but they kind of got cold feet along with the FDA, and they didn't want to make the switch at the height of COVID, which was unfortunate. So I just threw this graph in here so that you can see that even though there is some mortality from the biomedical, harvesting for bait is still the biggest cause of horseshoe crab mortality. And really the only way to curb that is through harvesting regulations. So one of the recurring themes in pretty much everything I've read about horseshoe crabs around the world is that one of the biggest threats to all four species is coastal development. So coastal development, shoreline hardening, coupled with climate change and sea level rise, is really depleting the range and number of spawning beaches available for horseshoe crabs, which is very sad. So there's a lot on here. I'll just go through it quickly, but some conservation efforts in the US and Europe. So basically, when it became clear in the 1990s that overharvesting of horseshoe crabs was becoming unsustainable, regulations began by the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission with several addendums. So in 1998, the ASFMC established a management plan for horseshoe crabs. They established a no-take zone in the Delaware Bay 2001, 2006. New Jersey prohibited commercial bait harvesting, which was great. In 2007, an ARM, or an adaptive restoration management framework, took other species into consideration. So for this, it took the red knot populations into account for the horseshoe crab harvest. And then, we'll jump ahead to 2018, the FDA approving the first endotoxin drug based on RFC testing. And what I just mentioned about the European Pharmacopoeia publishing the chapter on standards for the use. And then most recently was something I just found out, which is that a US federal court judge banned biomedical harvesting from a 1.6 million acre estuary in South Carolina near the Charles River Biomedical Laboratory, which is one of the labs that does the bleeding of the crabs. But unfortunately, the laboratory responded by opening up a lab up in Cape Cod. So we have yet to see what's going to happen with that. So just some conservation efforts in Asia. Should mention that assessment of the crab population size has been difficult in Asia because of a lack of baseline data and cross-border distribution of the species. So for decades, it's been sort of a free-for-all harvesting for human consumption. And some regions have looked to establishing marine protected areas and no-take zones, which is good. So one thing that was kind of cool was in 1978, Japan's Society for Conservation of the Horseshoe Crab was founded. 2012, there were permanent trawl bans in Hong Kong. As I mentioned, over time, several MPAs were established by mainland China, Taiwan, and Japan. And then, as I also mentioned, the Chinese and Japanese pharmacopoeia published guidelines for the use of the RFC test, which was great. So they are starting to roll that out in Asia. Oops. Another conservation effort is the development of bait bags and bait alternatives. So a bait bag, usually, for eel and whelk fisheries, they use like large pieces of horseshoe crab. So the bait bag uses a much smaller piece of the crab. And sometimes that's mixed with like a bait alternative. And primarily in the eel fisheries, the eel are really attracted to this substance in horseshoe crab eggs. So they found that, if you just add some of the horseshoe crab eggs to a bait alternative, then you can really cut down on using like whole crabs or whole female crabs in particular. So in 2021, the New York State DEC proposed mandatory use of bait bags for fishing whelk, but the proposal has not been fully adopted yet. Aquaculture is possible, but really only for juvenile horseshoe crabs. Horseshoe crabs are notoriously hard to rear in captivity beyond a certain age. But there are certain aquaculture facilities at Rutgers at the Aquatic Innovation Center. There's one down at Malloy's facility, Surcom, in West Sayville, Long Island. So they rear these little tiny crabs and then they release them. There's also one in Hong Kong at the Ocean Park Conservation Foundation. Outreach campaigns are really important for horseshoe crabs. The more people know about them, the more they're going to want to help them. So these are two outreach campaigns. One of them is called Green Eggs and Ham, which, I'm sorry, the Green Eggs and Sand, which was an educational curriculum designed for classrooms. And the other is the Just Flip 'em campaign, which was developed by the Environmental Research and Development Group. And I have to say, I really love this group because they have this description of themselves online. And it says that, I'll just read it here. They are a nonprofit wildlife conservation organization whose primary focus is to overcome the ignorance, indifference, and intolerance that inhibits the conservation of the world's 4 extant horseshoe crab species. So I kind of love that because it's kind of insisting that horseshoe crabs should have rights like humans. And I have to say, I'm totally okay with that. So, oh, here's just an example. This is something I got in the mail. I think it was from the Nature Conservancy, but it was an outreach campaign. And I don't know, I wasn't particularly fond of this one because I don't think horseshoe crabs are ugly. Beauty's in the eye of the beholder. So the last thing I'm going to talk about are spawning surveys, which are really important tools for adult stock assessment and to gauge population size. These surveys are held all summer at night. We have a lot of them on Long Island. And like I mentioned, these spawning events happen during the new and full moon high tides. So the horseshoe crabs are counted and some of them are given tags. So as you can see, they're given something called the button tag, these little white tags, which doesn't actually harm them. And if you happen to come across a horseshoe crab on the beach that has one of these tags, you can go to the US Fish and Wildlife Service website and report your sighting. So that's one way that we actually trace horseshoe crab movement. So I just put in this last graph here to show that there is a somewhat slow but steady decrease in population size. And this continues to decrease since this was published several years ago. So, and this is a decrease that's happening on Long Island as well as other areas of the US. And basically the general consensus is that there need to be even more strict harvesting limits on horseshoe crabs for bait, especially for female and spawning crabs. So and I have two people, I'm not sure if they're in the audience, but who are possibly going to join us tonight who do horseshoe crab surveys on Long Island. One of them is Cameron Janis. He works at the Waterfront Center. They run a horseshoe crab survey at Beekman and Theodore Roosevelt Beach. And the other person was Susan Hirschman, who runs one at Centerport Yacht Club. And I'm going to be joining Susan on Saturday night. And I believe Cameron actually is holding a survey on, I think I heard it was Sunday night. So if you want to get involved with these spawning surveys, become a citizen scientist, as they say, and go out and take part in one, you can go to the horseshoe crab, it's called newyorkhorseshoecrab.org, and you can find a site near you. And this is a survey program that's run by the DEC in conjunction with Cornell Cooperative Extension. I believe if you also go to Molloy College's website, if you look up Molloy College and search under horseshoe crabs, it will give you information on how to conduct your own survey. If you want to do one, you can submit your data to Molloy College. So, oops, I'm going to leave you with this message about what more can be done. Obviously, we need to, minimize the harvest quotas and use alternative bait or bait bags as much as possible. In the US, this is probably going to be the most possible. Finally, get US pharmacopoeia to follow suit with the European, Chinese, and Japanese pharmacopoeias on promoting the use of the synthetic RFC test. Minimizing coastal development and hardening of shorelines, easier said than done. But it's something that needs to be done to protect these spawning grounds. Definitely continuing the spawning surveys, aquaculture, and more public outreach campaigns. And the easiest thing that you can do, just as a member of society, every time you see a crab on the beach, if it seems to be struggling, just flip it over. They have an easier time flipping themselves in the water than they can on land. Actually, that tail that you see, it's called the telson. Don't ever pick it up by the tail because it can break off and then they'll be really out of luck. So you just gently flip them over. And then the other thing I would say is that if you happen to be at the beach and you see some kids who are, approaching a horseshoe crab or harassing it, which, I've come across more times than I would like to say, use it as a teaching moment. Tell them what you've learned about them and tell them why you should help them and not harm them. So I would just like to thank all of you for joining me tonight. I hope you learned a little bit more about horseshoe crabs, and I hope that, when you see one, I don't know, that you'll just remember some of the things that you learned. So I am going to open up the chat now, and somebody wrote they want to go out and count some crabs. So if anybody has a question, you can unmute yourself and I'll do my best to answer it.
Chris,
Yeah.
Is somebody before me?
I think it's me, Joanne. Can you,
Okay.
Go ahead,
can you
Diane.
explain again what the RFC is?
So yeah, so there's this, the RFC, so there's a substance in horseshoe crab blood. It's called the limulus amoebocyte lysate. And when that substance, like in a laboratory, when you put it in a petri dish with, if there's bacteria in the dish, it immediately forms this clot that you can see. So they've actually been testing pharmaceutical drugs and, all of these things in laboratories and using that substance from horseshoe crab blood to test for the presence of bacteria. Which is what, it's wild that for 30 years we've been relying on an animal, basically a substance from an animal to do this. So the RFC is a synthetic version of the drug that was developed by a scientist in Singapore, and it, doesn't use horseshoe crab blood, completely synthetic. So there are, some pharmaceutical companies that are beginning to use this, but, it's really only in the early days. So
Okay.
yeah, hopefully at some point we won't have to harvest the crabs anymore and, do this whole bleeding process, which.
Right, okay. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Christine?
Yes.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I was just curious, with all the other challenges that we've presented to the horseshoe crabs, has there been any studies that you're aware of that compare relate water quality to another thing
Is it
that's
Skip?
affecting- Yeah. Mhm.
Okay. Didn't see you on there, but I recognize your voice.
Uh,
So water quality is a tough one because, these crabs exist. They're able to survive in areas around the world where there is a high amount of pollution, and heavy metals and things. So it's really hard to determine like what it is in water quality and if it would be affecting them. So is that kind of what you were asking, or?
Yeah. Yeah, there'll be an interesting thing to kind of, if anybody's working on that, to see what the results might be,
Yeah, no, I haven't, I don't think I came across too many studies specifically looking at water quality, but it would be an interesting thing to look into. But again, like I said, it's they're really tough survivors, and they've gone through periods, in the past where they've dealt with a lot of different things in the ocean. But, anthropogenic pollution sources are, a different thing that they're dealing with now. But like I said, that doesn't seem to be the biggest thing that's driving like death of the species. So.
Anecdotally, it just seems like there's less horseshoe crabs than what I remember over the years. It seems like their numbers are decreasing locally,
Yeah, no, they definitely are. And I have a friend right now who's she works for basically Delaware's equivalent of our DEC. And she's down at the Delaware beach where they're, supposed to have the most horseshoe crabs in the world showing up. And she said the summer already, they're not seeing as many. So it's not a good sign. I mean, for horseshoe crabs, as well as, there's this dwindling bird species that depends on them. And what's really kind of sad, actually, is that I think the only reason the horseshoe crabs got recognized, that their numbers were dwindling was because of the bird population dwindling. So, I think the bird people made a bigger noise about it, and they finally started looking into, okay, what's the reason? It's because, we have these dwindling numbers of crabs and eggs. So yeah, there are a couple of things that need to happen. And one of them is to just taking a look at these harvesting quotas. And there's a lot of illegal harvesting going on too. I mean, it's not really reported, but people go over state lines, and there's just not enough, policing out there to be able to catch people in the act.
Plus, they're self-reported,
Yeah.
so
Yes.
they can say anything they want.
Yes,
They're
exactly. Is that Sue?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Hi.
Okay. Hi. Can't see everybody's name on here at once, but I'm going by voices. So yeah, it's really, it's hard to get an idea of what's going on in every state and every region at once. And like I mentioned, in Asia, because they're like, we just have the United States that we're dealing with here. Over there, it's going across country lines and, different regions and everything. So it's even harder. Okay. All right.
Chris?
Yeah.
One more question. Do you know is there a lot of education in the schools about horseshoe crabs, or is there really not?
So, I I'm not entirely sure. I actually should probably talk to more local teachers. I don't know if anybody's on here who teaches on Long Island science. You know, I know everything's kind of done according to the core curriculum right now. So, you know, I don't know if there's room for horseshoe crabs in that curriculum, sadly, but
I'm wondering.
yeah.
The answer is no.
Oh, okay.
But when I was teaching, I created a marine science program in Heffalo Hills. And after 1 year, 125 students signed up. And we did include, I always included a horseshoe crab unit for like 2
Okay.
weeks. But one of my students who was a fisherman went out and collected 160 horseshoe crabs. And I said, I'm not signing your yearbook. You know, what are you doing? You know, all this conservation that I was teaching in class. But he says it was legal, Mrs. Hirschman. And he came up to Centerport actually and collected them, you know, right up here.
God, well, what was he collecting them for? Just to
Right.
For bait.
for bait?
He was a fisherman himself, the kid. And he made so much money, he bought himself a truck.
Oh God. I guess he was very proud of himself. Well,
Yeah, he was. And I was very mad at him.
yeah.
Christine, anyone who's teaching could sneak in a unit or a little couple of days with regard to endangered and nearly extinct species. There's
Yeah.
always a way to get them squeezed into that topic instead of the usual creatures that we talk about. So they could get a little publicity too.
Oh, it was for endangered species.
Yeah, and that is part of the New York State Regents biology program.
Mhm.
Yes,
Okay.
Not
And
necessarily
one
horseshoe
other-
crabs, but endangered species, absolutely.
yes.
So, and I'm just seeing Brianne on here too, Brianne Ross, who teaches at Our Lady of Mercy Academy. She says, I teach my students in marine science, but also in AP environmental science.
Yeah.
So,
And I taught a whole unit to my English as a second language students when I was still teaching. And they absolutely loved it. They were fascinated. They've never seen them before.
Yeah.
right.
I would bring in the mults, and each kid would have one, and we had nature journals, and they were drawing everything from the beginning, diatoms and so on, all the way up through sharks and fish. And part of the units was to draw the horseshoe crabs, and they liked drawing them. They weren't as hard as you think to draw.
Yeah, I
They
know.
were all on the aboral side.
Barbara, who was on there, I know did that unit with her ESL kids, and they made horseshoe crabs out of paper plates. Made a little horseshoe crab design. So yeah, it's good to get them young because like I said, you know, you go to the beach and because horseshoe crabs have these tails, you know, kids are always drawn to like picking them up and swinging them around, and it's really horrible to see. So yeah, it's just really getting out there and telling them like, look, they're really fragile. They're, you know, good creatures. We should
I know
protect.
before COVID that the Waterfront Center did some education as far as horseshoe crabs are concerned, but you know, they were going into schools, but you know, of course, COVID changed a lot of that.
Yeah.
But you know, maybe they'll start doing it more. But of course, if it were incorporated into the curriculum, that would be obviously the optimum. You know, even just, you know, it doesn't have to be a whole unit, but just, you know, a half a unit, but to be educated about these creatures would be extremely important, as Barbara Suter said, you know, get them young.
I think one of the things too is that they're not, you know, with the endangered species, it's like their numbers are obviously dwindling, but they're not classified as endangered yet. So yeah, it's difficult to get it into curriculum.
I think if somehow the message were more spread that how essential they have been to our survival as humans,
Yeah.
how absolutely connected we are to them, and we should, you know, we should be very grateful for their existence. I don't think very many people realize that or understand it.
Yeah, almost nobody.
That might change some minds once they learn that.
I mean, could you all just raise your hands of how many people knew that we use their blood in biomedical? Is there anybody who didn't? Oh, you did. Okay. So good. A good number of people.
I don't have a raise my hand thing here.
Really learned a lot, Christine. That was an excellent presentation. We're watching it over here and just, learned some things I never knew before, including that the ones that we see are often 10 years old. I mean, they're not really considered mature or, that
Yeah.
kind of mature until they're 10 years old, which is something that just blows my mind. So it's really incredible. I mean,
I think-
excellent job.
I have at the beginning here, if I just go, oh, there it is. I picked this up on the beach yesterday, actually. And this was, like a hollowed out shell, but it blew me away. I mean, it was enormous, first of all, and then it had like this crazy pattern on the inside, but this, must have been a really old mama. Yeah, because, obviously a female because of its size. So. All right, so anybody else before we go?
How far do they travel? Do we know like how big of their range is of movement?
So there is somebody actually out at Stony Brook now who's like one of the first people who is putting like acoustic tags on them. And I think they followed one that went from basically like the North Shore of Long Island to the South Shore of Long Island. They can go out to the continental shelf and back, we know that. But as far as traveling great distances, they have a lot of like what they call it site fidelity when it comes to spawning beaches. So they kind of tend to stay within their own range. So I hope that kind of answers it a little bit,
Yeah.
but it's not like it's not like bird species where they're traveling up and down the entire coast.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good.
And that I
Okay.
think concludes our speaker series for the season. And
Thank you, Christine.
start up
Until
again.
September, yes, we take a break for the summer. We'll reconvene in September.
Yeah. And if you're out there, join us on our monthly beach cleanups. We'll be posting.
Or at the parade on Monday.
Oh, yeah, the parade. Go march in the parade, 9:30 a.m. with Friends of the Bay.
Thanks so much, Christine.
All right,
Thanks,
thank you.
Chris. Thank you. It was wonderful.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. All right.
Really was
Yeah,
great.
I'm gonna try to stop recording too. Let's see. Stop.